All right, welcome everyone to another Veeam Public Cloud webinar. This time we are taking a little bit more of a technical architectural approach with a lot of demos sprinkled in there. And it's really just about how to best build your Azure backup environment. Now, a lot of what we're going to be discussing today is related to Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure. This is our ability to natively protect Azure workloads. But some of these core principles will also scale out across other clouds, AWS and Azure. And if you're using a different solution today, some of these best practices will also apply to your current solution. A couple of introductions before we get started. My name is Sam Nichols, Director of Public Cloud Product Marketing. So I get to take care of all the fun, new, exciting stuff going on with Veeam across the major hyperscale public clouds, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. And I'm also joined by David for one of many webinars that we have together today. So we should have a good rapport and flow going. David, a few welcome words from you.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm David Hill, Global Technologist in the Veeam Product Strategy Group, and I'm very excited to get talking about cloudy stuff today.
Absolutely. So like I say, we are taking a technical architectural approach to this one, but for anyone that is not familiar with what Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure is, we do have a couple of minutes just to help give you the foundational knowledge that you need. So Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure is our Azure native backup and recovery tool for protecting workloads in Azure, like your Azure VMs, Azure SQL, and some new stuff coming in the next release, which we'll be talking about at the end of this webinar. But the concept behind it is relatively straightforward. So it is Azure native, and we'll get into a little bit what we mean by native in a second. We want to make sure that you guys are as cost optimized as possible, right? In the public cloud where you pay for each and every single component of compute, networking, storage, API calls, we want to make this product as cost effective as possible so you guys can have that backup and recovery of your Azure workloads without getting that surprise bill shock at the end of every single month. Like, data protection is costing me how much? We're here to help you solve that. Security and compliance is also up there as well. I think that's at the forefront of pretty much every IT professional's mind right now. The product absolutely adheres to Azure security best practices. We integrate with a number of Azure security services as well, like Azure Key Vault. But again, we'll get into that in the demo and how to design security while also retaining data in a compliant manner throughout the demos and the architectural discussion. And then the final piece is around hybridity, right? We live in a hybrid cloud world. The hybrid cloud is not a transitionary phase to everything being in the cloud. It is here to stay, right? So you likely have workloads running on premises, physical, virtual, whatever they might be, NAS. You likely have workloads running in Azure today if you're on this webinar, or you're at least interested in doing so. And you may also have workloads running in other clouds like AWS and Google. The best way to protect this is with that native approach, but that doesn't mean that you have to have a bunch of point products. We want you to be able to centrally manage everything under a common control plane, common policy model, so that data protection is consistent across all your environments, and it's much easier for you to do so. So before we start getting into it, just a couple of comments on what we mean by native by design. So native is absolutely the best approach to go when it comes to protecting workloads in Azure as well as other clouds. So Veeam makes sure that we integrate with a number of native services and integrations across the Azure platform to give you best-in-class protection. So first off is utilizing those native snapshots. Snapshots are pretty much the threshold for being deemed native. Snapshots are great for low RPOs, right? We can schedule them very, very frequently. They're also great for low RTOs. It's much quicker to recover from a snapshot than it would be, say, an image-based backup stored in some sort of object storage. And then we can wrap all of this up with policy-based automation to make, I guess, a product that you can just set and forget. You don't need to babysit backup 24/7. It will do all of this for you. The next part is around storage, right? So of course we have the Azure disks that the snapshots are stored on, but that can get expensive, especially we've got to retain our data for a lengthy period of time. So we also utilize varying degrees of object storage, Azure Blob Hot, Azure Blob Cool, and archive storage. So you can tier these snapshots as image-based backups onto this native storage so you can meet your retention requirements, be that for compliance or maybe just your own sanity, while also keeping that bill much lower. And then the final piece is security, right? We're talking about things like cross-subscription, which we'll get into in a minute, Azure Key Vault, multi-factor authentication, role-based access control, ultimately to make sure that your protection data is isolated from your production data and is secure as possible. David, anything you want to add around this slide?
Yeah, just kind of touching on the security aspect and the cross-subscription piece. That's really important when you want to kind of isolate your data from your production workloads. And a lot of people keep their backup data in the same subscription, but by putting it across different subscriptions, leveraging different Azure Active Directories, you can implement a very secure data protection solution just by those two key areas as well. And of course, the Azure Key Vault, you can tie it all in to make a very secure backup solution.
Absolutely. You kind of stole my thunder there because this is the first bit of the architectural component. Right up, we have a pretty simple one. It is going to build out and get more and more complex. But, you know, for right now, let's just say you've got your Microsoft Azure is the white box, and then this I don't know, gray box is your production subscription, and that's where you have your production workloads living, right? Whether those are Azure virtual machines, things like Azure SQL, and your first response might be, okay, I'm going to start to back these up. I'm going to deploy the Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure appliance or other appliance into the same subscription. And we're here to tell you that that is not best practice for reasons that David just mentioned, right? The concept of logical separation, like we have on premises, applies just the same in the cloud. There's just different concepts and components on how to do that. So in Azure, we're talking about subscriptions as those security boundaries. In AWS, we would deem those as accounts. In Google Cloud, we would think that to be projects. But either way, the best thing to do would be to have a dedicated subscription for that Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure appliance. Again, it's because of that logical separation. If production was ever compromised and backup, the backup appliance lived in production, all your backup data lived in production, then all of that has now been compromised. Whereas if we separate these out, isolate our appliance, isolate our backup data, we're inherently building that security in. So whether or not you're already using Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure, you're going to start thinking about using it. If you haven't done it this way, we would deem this to be best practice from a security perspective. And David is now going to walk through a quick demo on how to deploy this so you can kind of just see how this all works. So Mr. Hill, it's coming over your way for you to share your screen.
Right, there we go. Hopefully you can see all this. So the first piece I'm going to show you is just how quickly and easily you can deploy Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure. And the first thing you do is you log into your Azure portal, and then you go to the marketplace, and you see here we've just done a quick search for Veeam, and you can see there's quite a number of Veeam products out in the marketplace. Now, what you have to do is pick your edition. So for this example, we're just going to say I want the Azure Free Edition, and I'm just going to create that. So some basic Azure questions that we need to create and set up. So first thing is, what subscription do I want to put it in? As Sam just showed you in that diagram, I'm going to pick my demo account. I'm going to say I want to create a new resource group. So I'm just going to say create, and I'm just going to say webinar demo so we know which one it is. Give it a virtual machine name. So webinar demo 01 sounds good to me. And what region do we want to put it in? So we can pick any of the Azure regions. I'm just going to say US Central, even though my English accent doesn't sound very American. And then we just go through and we can specify some usernames, key pairs, again, all around the security aspects. Step through, we can pick the default options, we can change any of the cost models that we want to do around that virtual machine, because remember what we're actually doing is deploying an appliance. Then we'll pick our networking. For this example, I'm just going to say I want everything to be new, but any virtual networks you have existing, see, like I've got some Veeam Backup Azure ones, previous ones I've created, you can add those in there as well. Next, we say the management, we ignore all that. And you just step through the wizard until you come to the point where you review and create. Azure obviously goes away and thinks about it, tells you how much it's going to cost to run this appliance. You all now know my Azure email address and phone number, so I look forward to getting hit up on my phone. And then we simply say create. What that will actually do is generate a new key pair, so we can download that. Just in case we ever need to troubleshoot with Veeam support, we can actually SSH into the appliance. And that's it. It's now off deploying that appliance into my Microsoft Azure account. And it will go through a number of steps. And once that's actually completed, the appliance will be configured, and we can simply go in and configure things like our accounts and repositories and so on. So if I just change my window, because we don't really want to wait for that, and I just switch to this one, what we can actually now do is take a look at an appliance that I've already deployed, because obviously for the interest of time for this webinar. And the first thing you'll notice is once you've deployed Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure, you get presented with the Getting Started page, and you get a number of options. So the first thing we have to do is add in our Microsoft Azure account. That's really straightforward. We just say add. We'll give this a name of demo. Do we want to create a service account automatically, or do we want to specify an existing one? If you do it automatically, it'll just go create that principal account with the minimum privileges required. And then much like you do with Netflix and Apple TV and everything, you're presented with a code, you go log in, you put your Azure credentials in, and then it will automatically create that service account. We have that already configured. If we go back to our Getting Started, the next thing we need to do is review our workers configuration. You'll see more about them as we go through the slides, but we configure that just by simply saying add, pick the region we want to configure. So I'm just going to pick East US as an example. We say next, and then we can go and create network. So we can give it a name of webinar demo. Everything is done automatically as well, so we don't really need to worry about all the different configuration options. We can do it all through the wizard. And then once this finishes, we'll wait for Microsoft Azure to do its funky stuff on the back end. We can specify different security groups, which ones we want to use. Do we want public IP addresses? So we just say finish, and that will then go and configure our worker networks. And then the final thing that we do is we configure our backup repositories. So we see I've already got some already created here. And again, everything's done in an automated fashion. So if we say, here's a webinar demo, what Azure account do I want to use? Pick my storage account, so I can go pick whichever storage accounts I have configured. Do I want to go specify a particular container? So we'll just say a demo one, and then we can actually say, right, create new folder. And then we can either create individual storage tiers for our repositories, or we can say go and automatically create all of these for us. As Sam touched on the encryption aspects, we can turn on Azure encryption if we want to. We can use an Azure Vault and encryption key, or we can just put in a password. We're not going to do that for this demo. And then we just say next and finish. And we now have Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure configured, ready to go and create a backup policy with all our repositories and everything ready. So with that, I'll hand it to you.
Yeah, so in less than 10 minutes, you've basically got an appliance deployed and configured, just as easy as that. So I'm going to bring the ball back. You actually got a little bit ahead of us, David, in terms of the configuration piece, because obviously we ran through the deployment here. Are you guys seeing the right screen, by the way?
Yes, we are.
Because GoToWebinar is freezing up on me, go figure. All right, so you're seeing the right screen, David?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. Then you went through your demo deployment, and this is just kind of what it would look like from a configuration standpoint, right? So David deployed the Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure appliance in a new subscription. He created his pool of workers, which we'll go through in just a second, and then also his storage buckets. So as you saw, he created the different tiers, so Azure Blob, Hot, Cool, and then the archive storage. And you can absolutely do that in a separate subscription as well. So certainly 3 subscriptions to manage, but this is the most secure way. And you can broker secure connections between all of those using Azure Active Directory. So I do want to pause on this a little bit. And we got a question. Timothy is asking, when will version 4 be available? Looking forward to solving some bugs. Version 4 is coming very, very soon, and we'll be covering what's coming in that towards the end of the webinar. But it is coming probably within the next 4 weeks, Timothy. So back to this, the worker pool. David, why don't you walk us through what are workers? What do they do? How does Veeam leverage them?
Yeah, so a worker is essentially a very small appliance. It gets deployed in that particular region. And what it does is it helps assist with data transfer. So if you're taking backups of, say, a workload in, I don't know, central US as an example, and you want to offload those backups, you take your snapshots, you want to offload those backups out to these different backup repositories in those regions. A worker will just spin up automatically from Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure and do the data transfer, the data processing in that region. Now, what's really good about that is it helps reduce the storage costs because you're doing the data transfers within that region. Anytime you transfer data out of a region, say you're doing it from central US to east US, you will actually pay a fee for that to move that data around. So by spinning up a worker, very small Azure virtual machine in that region, we can transfer the data and do all that data processing within the region and help reduce your storage and transfer costs.
Fantastic. So essentially, they're almost like proxies, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Anyone who's familiar with Veeam backup and replication will think of how we do it with proxies. They're exactly the same thing.
And again, like you say, the fantastic thing about these are ephemeral, right? So we'll automatically spin them up and spin them down, so they're not consistently running there or constantly even running in the background. Because again, in the public cloud, we're paying for all of the resources we consume. Why would we want to be consuming compute resources that these workers live on if they're not actually performing anything? So these workers are going to be used when we do things like create an image-based backup of the snapshots and store those onto the object storage in Azure. We will leverage them when we do things like file level recovery, or when we do a recovery from a image-based backup on the object storage as well. And again, as and when we do that, Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure will automatically spin it up. It will complete its task, and then we'll automatically shut it down, helping keep that bill down and lower your total cost of ownership of an Azure backup and recovery solution. So you walked us through that. You've already walked us through the demo for this one. So this is where we start to get into the meat of things on how are we actually protecting in Azure. So if you recall when we were talking about nativeness, we were talking about snapshots, right? So the first thing that we do when we create our policies is create a snapshot schedule. So we'll create these volume snapshots of the Azure VMs that live on Azure disks. We're talking about Azure SQL, we'll create a staged copy, and that's all defined by that policy-based automation. All right, so again, the ideal situation here is that you create a policy or set of policies that have, you know, different, let's call them tiers of protection in terms of frequency of snapshots, length of retention, that kind of thing, based on how mission critical the workload living on an Azure VM is, or how critical this database might be. So that is, again, the first thing that we would ultimately create as a data protection mechanism. But just like on premises, you know, a snapshot isn't a replacement for a backup. It's not the be all end all when it comes to data protection. It certainly has its pros, again, low RPOs, low RTOs, but it has its cons as well, right? They are not stored independently of the original disk. So that can expose us to a single point of failure. Again, if that production subscription was ever compromised and we're only leveraging snapshots that live there, those will likely also be compromised as well. And again, from a cost angle as well, right? Snapshots live on Azure disks, which are more expensive storage within Azure. If we have to keep those for 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, some industries as long as 7, 10 years, or sometimes even forever, keeping that as a snapshot is going to be a lot of money. What we're going to want to do is start to tier that off onto much, much more cost-effective object storage. And again, you've got differing tiers with differing pros and cons, some being more expensive but more performant, some being very, very cheap but being less performant, like Azure Archive Storage. And this is where the workers come into play, right? So the workers then start to either, for Azure SQL, do a backpack export, for our volume snapshots, create that image-based backup, process those, and start to store them on that Azure Blob Hot and Cool. So what we do is we see folks that do maybe hourlies, dailies, snapshots, will have those living on the disks, but sometimes they're weeklies, more often than not monthlies or even yearlies are stored across here. Again, those ones that are retained for a much longer period of time, we want to be on a much more cost-effective storage, especially as the likelihood of needing to recover something that's 6, 12 months old is much, much smaller than something that is 6 or 12 hours old. David, anything you want to add on this diagram architecture before I pass it back to you for the demo, and you can show us how this all works in the actual UI?
Yeah, so just on like the backpack exports and stuff, obviously that's a Microsoft tool that's used to actually export Azure SQL. It exports it into a particular format, and then we can use those workers to actually offload those backpack backups and exports out to those storage tiers. So from that perspective, it gives us a lot of granular control over what we're actually protecting within Azure SQL to make sure that we're taking the backups that are necessary to be able to provide that point in time restore that we need when we're actually doing the restores.
Awesome. So I am going to pass it back to you, my friend, so you can walk us through a demo of, let's create a policy or two, and maybe walk us through some of the recovery components as well and the options that we have there. While you're bringing that up, we do have a question from Tim. Do you know if the model of spin up when needed going to be available for Veeam backup for Office 365 as well? I'm not 100% sure I understand that question, David. You might be talking about like a worker-based operation.
Let me. No, Office 365, we do that very differently through, I guess what you're asking is if we use the worker nodes in Office 365 and transfer rates, we don't have any plans to use that worker node for Office 365. Obviously, Veeam Backup for Office 365 is a separate product, and the way that does it is through the Office 365 APIs. Hopefully that answers the question. So hopefully you can all see my screen, and what I'm going to show you now is just a quick way of creating a backup policy. I already have some that I've already made as well for the interest in showing you some recovery options. But simply what we do is we go to policies and we click the add button. And again, I'll just give this an example of webinar demo. We can pick our Azure Active Directory. So if we have multiple Azure Active Directories, they're there. And we can pick our regions. So in true form, I'm going to go with Central US, add that as a region, but I can pick one region, many regions, or all of these regions. And then we pick what we want to protect. So we have a number of options here. We can say all resources, and that would protect everything in this policy in the regions that we selected. Or we can break it down. We can say, I just want to protect everything in one of these subscriptions, as an example. Or I can do it via resource group. So I can go and pick resource groups. You can see I actually have a resource group called backup, one called restore, and a number of other ones as well. Or we can go in and we can do it via virtual machines. So we can break it down and just pick individual virtual machines in those regions. So I'm just going to pick as an example Linux 001. But we also have the option to do tags as well. So if we want to automate this, we can actually pick some Azure tags, and then anything that we tag any Azure virtual machines with those will be automatically protected. But I'll go back and I'll just pick that one virtual machine for this, and we'll say protect, and we see it get added down the bottom here. We'll apply that. Next, we have the ability to do application aware backups. So we can turn on application aware snapshots, which leverages the Windows Volume Shadow service. We can turn on pre and post scripts for backups as well. So we can go in, we can say, I want to run this script before the backup, run this script after the backup, and what kind of additional options we have. So if you think about protecting databases that are running in like Azure VMs, you can kind of stop the database, take the snapshot and the backup, and then start the database again. And do the same for Windows or Linux. Next, we come to our targets. So do we want to enable backups? Now, as Sam was showing you in the diagrams, the backups allow us to offload those out to our repositories. So we can turn that on. And then we come to our scheduling. Do we want to do daily, weekly, monthly, yearly for this policy? If we turn it on, we can specify how often we want to take our snapshot. So we can say I can maybe take a snapshot at 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and I want to take a snapshot and back up at 9 a.m. every day. How often do I want to run it? What are my retention periods? And then what repository do I want to store it in? So we saw that we had the webinar demo hot and cool automatically pre-created, as we did through the configuration demo. So we apply that. We can specify as well that maybe I want to run a backup every year. How many years do I want to keep them for? So I can say I want to keep these backups for 10 years. When do we want to take them? And what repository do I want to store them in? Next, we come to our cost estimation wizard, and funnily enough, it's not picked up what I want to protect for some reason. That's because it's blank. There's a new one. So we'll add that one in as well. Apply. And true to form in a demo, it's not picking up our cost estimations. But typically what you see here is our snapshots show you how much this is going to cost based on Azure list prices. Then we walk through and we see that all our settings are configured, and we simply say finish. We can now go ahead and we can run that backup policy. And if we look at one that I created earlier, we see that we already have some virtual machines configured around our backup policies, how they're running, our snapshots are taken, and what's going on with them. So that's how simple it is to set up a backup policy. I'll show you in Azure SQL as well how easy this is. So we'll call this a webinar demo. We'll pick our Azure Active Directory again. So very similar policy to what we created. But what we're doing is we're actually saying I want to protect my Azure SQL. So that platform as a service Azure. We can pick from our names of databases. We want to protect that. Go through. Do we want to use a staging server or use a production server? So we can go in, we can pick our staging server, our SQL account. If we want to add it in, we can create a new one. And say finish. Next, we can again specify our scheduling. So how often do we want to take the backups? What repository do we want to store it on? And then we can see in the cost estimation wizard how much that's going to cost. So we can see that taking a backup is going to cost us 52 cents, the transaction costs are 47 cents, and so on. So it's very easy, very simple to configure not only backing up our virtual machines, but also our Azure SQL off these resources tabs.
And
Once we
Dan
have
pointed out in the comments, David, that the retention estimator could not estimate because the retention time was too long. So I think that you've got to go into that policy that you created if it's still there.
Oh, because I gave an example of 10 years. Yeah, good point. Haha. I can show you here anyway. The cost estimation wizard will show you exactly here that obviously based on the costs of those two virtual machines, the snapshots, the backups, and the transaction costs, how much that's going to cost there.
Dan, I think you got a job, mate. David, you're fired.
Yeah. So once we've done that, the protected data is available and we can actually go and perform the restores direct from these. So the restore there, we can go in, we can say, right, okay, I have my snapshots, I have my backups. What do I want to restore? So I can do my VM restores direct. I can restore just the disk or the file level recovery. So from that perspective, if I just say I want to do a restore of this virtual machine, I can go in. I can specify my Azure Active Directory account. I can restore to the original location or to a new location. And then what do I want to recover to? So what resource group, what disks do I want to pick, what network do I want to pick, and so on. And it's really simple, really easy to perform a restore as well. Same with the Azure SQL. We won't see anything there because I've just created a policy in the demo, but we can restore in place and out of place. The other thing that we're able to do as well is that file level recovery. So we can just go in, say that we want to do a file level recovery, and we can recover individual files through a Veeam Explorer window in a web browser that allows us to recover that in that granular data direct to our desktops. So I'm going to hand it back to you, Sam.
All right, fantastic. So that kind of gives you guys hopefully a good overview on firstly how to go out and deploy and configure it, but some of the ideas around how you can actually protect these items within your environment. So the final piece that we spoke about right at the beginning of the presentation was around hybridity, right? So the likelihood is you guys live in a hybrid environment. You may be responsible for protecting Azure only. You might be responsible for protecting absolutely everything within your organization's environment. So how does Veeam make that possible? So you guys hopefully know about Veeam Backup and Replication. It's our flagship product. It's what started Veeam basically in terms of protecting everything across all of your environments. So Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure absolutely integrates with Veeam Backup and Replication. If you are using, I think it's version 11A or beyond, you don't even need to download a plugin or anything like that. It's all there. And the deployment that we started off with can actually be performed by Veeam Backup and Replication. So you can go out and create a new appliance in Microsoft Azure from Veeam Backup and Replication and start protecting everything. Or you can link an existing Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure appliance with your Veeam Backup and Replication server. And that gives you a number of benefits. The first one is centralized management. So you now have solutions that are native to and purpose-built for each environment that you might have, right? So we've got agent-based approaches for physical machines on premises. You could use those agents in the cloud as well if you want, by the way. You've got our agentless approach for virtualized environments, VMware, Hyper-V, Nutanix AHV. And now you've got a native backup and recovery solution for Microsoft Azure that gives you that best-in-class protection, but without the headaches of managing, again, multiple point products, sometimes from the same vendor, sometimes from different vendors. And the same applies for AWS and Google. So you now have everything under that common control plane that you're already familiar with, VBR, and you're getting that best-in-class protection. It also unlocks a number of other advantages as well, beyond just centralized management. And the other one is around ownership, control, and portability of your data, right? We know that we are in a stage where, the cloud is at least the de facto standard for developing and deploying any new applications. We're also looking at some lift and shift motions, some modernization motions of existing workloads on premises that might be well suited for the cloud. Thanks to the VBK backup format that is, I guess, non-descriptive that we use across all of our products, you can now use that backup to migrate across different environments. Now, that could be a virtual machine or a physical machine that lives on premises that you want to power on in Azure and have it run there. It might be an Azure VM that you now want to live in AWS or Google Cloud, or even on premises, right? It seems a bit against the grain to be saying moving workloads from the cloud back on premises, but we're absolutely seeing it happen, right? There's sometimes been a bit of over rotation towards the public cloud. We get the workload running up there and it's just not meeting our needs, right? Whether that's from a performance standpoint, a data sovereignty standpoint, maybe it's from a cost one, and we would just want to bring it back on premises. It was better off running there. And that's why we think, hybrid is not this transitory phase from everything on premises to everything in the cloud. Hybrid is here now and here to stay, right? Because some things run better in the cloud than they do on premises and make more sense there. And the same goes true. Some things work better on premises than they do in the cloud. It gives us a very heterogeneous environment that on the surface of things can be a bit of a nightmare to manage, especially from a data protection standpoint. But Veeam is here to make that as easy as possible through this integration. So you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. Purpose-built and recovery for each environment, still a common control plane. So the next part of the demo that Dave is going to show you is how that integration with VBR works. So back to you, I think, for the second to last time, David.
Yeah, what I'm actually going to show you first is why we got a zero cost, and just to show you how clever Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure is. So the backup resource group that I created earlier as a backup policy has that Linux 001 VM in and the Win 003. Over here, when I created it and I specified what I wanted to protect, I went in, I picked my particular virtual machine and I said I wanted to protect that one. And if I click the protect button and then go to the cost estimation, we see we're getting zero cost. Now it's telling me it's going to cost me nothing because I'm already protecting it through my other backup policy that's protecting just the resource group. So it's not going to take more backups of that because I've already pre-configured a backup policy. If I now go back here and I specify all my resources, there's other virtual machines in there that can be protected. And we now see that it's picking them up, and the other ones are going to be protected with this policy, but the two that I already have protected are not included. So that is why we were getting a zero cost option. And I can go in and I can change this to 10 years and we can see that the cost goes up. I can lower it down to 1 year and we'll see that the cost goes down. So just to show you the power of Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure, even when you go and pre-create a backup policy for the same virtual machines, it figures it out and tells you what the cost of that is going to be. So with that, I'm going to show you now how this works in a centralized management way. So with the integration with Veeam backup and replication, what we actually see is anyone who's familiar with Veeam backup and replication will know about our backup jobs. And we see that we have a list of different types of workload. So we have some Windows agents, we've got some vSphere backups, and then we've got our Microsoft Azure virtual machines that we're creating. There's that policy that I've just created. There's the other one I have with my backup resource group that I have. And then we also see that we have like some AWS ones and so on. So what this allows us to do is if we go to our backup infrastructure, we can go to manage servers much in the same way that we go and add vSphere or Hyper-V. We can pick what we want to actually protect. So we can say, right, I want to go protect my Microsoft Azure workloads. Do I want to connect to an existing appliance or deploy a new appliance? And then we'll walk through and we'll add in our Azure account. We'll pick our subscriptions that we want to use. So in exactly the same way that we deploy through the marketplace, we're also able to do directly from Veeam backup and replication. So we can walk through, again, we give it names, and I'm not going to go through all the steps, but you can see that that's exactly the same way that we deploy through the Azure marketplace. Once we've deployed that, as I say, we can then go and we can create our backup policies as we did. We have our Azure SQL ones that we've created and protected. Here's the one that we did with our demo. I can right click on this, I can start, and that will now go and protect that database. But it doesn't just stop there. It's not just about managing all our backup policies. If I go over and we look at snapshots, I can look at all my snapshots from all my different public clouds. So again, there's my one that I created earlier, my backup resource group. And I can actually just say from Veeam backup and replication, I want to go and restore this snapshot. And I'll go through the same workflow that I showed you earlier when I want to do a recovery. But what about my backups as well? It's not just about snapshots. So if I go to my external repository, and this is where the centralized data management becomes very, very powerful. So if I look here, I have my AWS, Google, and Microsoft Azure, and I have my backup policies that I created. And if I expand these, I can just right click on these, and I have the ability to go in and restore all these different workloads into different regions. So I'll show you an example here. I can take an AWS backup and I can go and restore this to Microsoft Azure. So I can say, right, okay, I want to do a conversion, and I'll just go through. Here's my EC2 instance. What's my Azure account? What's my location? Pick my virtual machine size. Now, for anyone who's familiar with different cloud platforms, they do it all in different ways. So I can say that I want to take this EC2 instance. It will look to see what is available in Microsoft Azure. And then I can say, right, okay, I want to edit this. I want to pick my default sizes. What storage account should I use? What resource group do I want to pick? So that particular backup one that I'm protecting. And then I go through and I pick my networks. Do I want to assign a public IP or not? And then I can just say next. Do I want to do a secure restore? So if I wanted to actually scan this virtual machine or this EC2 instance that I'm recovering for any malware or anything, I can actually scan that as well before I perform the actual full restore. It's fully scanned by antivirus, which is very powerful. And then I just say yes, finish. And what it will actually do is it'll pull that backup from the AWS public cloud and go and restore that into Microsoft Azure and create that virtual machine. And the same applies for when we are restoring Azure to AWS, Azure to GCP. I can do an instant VM recovery to vSphere, for example. I can recover, if I really wanted to, I could take that virtual machine and recover it to a physical Windows machine as well. So it gives us a lot of options. But also what we're able to do is also do things like backup copy jobs. So I can go and create a backup copy of that particular, I'll call this webinar demo again, pick the virtual machine that I was protecting, and because I've already got one configured, I've got nothing to copy. So I'll show you the existing one. So I can look at this and I can pick my objects, that Linux 001, and then I can pick the targets and the schedule, and I can actually do a backup copy job to take a copy of that particular virtual machine from my Azure blob storage, copy it to my local backup repository, which allows me to then have multiple copies of that data so I can meet the 3-2-1 rule. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Sam.
Awesome, thanks very much, David. So we do have some questions that have come in that I want to answer before we get to the end of it. So Timothy asks a good one. To speed up restores, David, do they just have to spin up more powerful workers?
Yeah, so you can specify. Let me share my screen again. So in the actual console, when we're configuring the worker nodes, if I go to my workers, we can actually configure what VM size we want. So we have like sizing guides and stuff and the help center, and you can actually go in and pick. Now we pick like just a 2 vCPU and a 4 gig VM, but you can obviously go wild and go for 96 VPUs and vCPUs and 672 gig if you want. Obviously it's going to cost more money. So taking the cost versus performance into consideration, but it's very simple. And then you can specify a minimum and a maximum. Because these are dynamic, they get spun up when they're needed. You can take a minimum and a maximum of those, and it won't ever allow you to have more than those, but obviously the minimum is always 1.
Great, another question. This one's from Aaron. Can you integrate the Veeam backup from Microsoft Azure in with enterprise on-prem VNR? So you absolutely can connect Veeam backup and replication to a free edition of Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure. But as you start doing that, it will no longer act in a free capacity. So what I mean by that is your pool of Veeam Universal licenses that are hosted within VBR, once it detects that connection to Microsoft Azure, it will start applying a single Veeam Universal license per instance, whether that's a VM, database, irrespective of size. So you have 5 instances in Azure and you connect it to VBR, it will consume 5 Veeam Universal licenses. One other thing that I want to confirm here is, Aaron, you mentioned enterprise on-prem VNR. I don't know if you mean enterprise edition. If you're saying that, then you might be a per socket based customer. Socket based licensing and connection with VBR and Veeam backup from Microsoft Azure does not work. It is just Veeam Universal license. Another good question, this one's from Troy. Does the cost estimator take into account egress charges for restoring backups between different cloud providers? No, it does not. So the cost estimator only looks at the charges within Microsoft Azure. As you start to use Veeam backup and replication to move data outside of Azure, you're using a different console, so that's not taken into consideration. But Azure, all of the cloud providers are very transparent in their pricing. If you just type in egress calculator on Google, Microsoft has that there and you can calculate how much the egress fees are. David, this one's for you. Timothy's asking, is there a way to get an estimated time to restore?
No, that obviously depends on a lot of different caveats really. So, You know, it's that age-old question of how long's a piece of string. What are you restoring? How big is it? What region are you pulling it from? What region are you restoring it to? You know, are you doing it from snapshots? Are you doing it from backups? Are you pulling it from cold storage, hot storage, those kind of things? So no, we don't give an estimating wizard or guidelines, because essentially they just end up like Microsoft minutes, and then it's a case of, you know, how long is that going to be? We've all been there where Microsoft, when you're copying a file, says it's going to take 5 minutes and you're there 3 days later. So no, we typically avoid doing the Microsoft minutes type thing.
Okay, awesome. Well, we've got 10 minutes left, so I do want to go through a little bit on what's new in version 4. Keep the questions coming in. If we don't have the time to answer them, I'm happy to stay beyond if you guys are. If not, we can always answer them by email or jump on another call with you guys. But we do have version 4 coming very, very soon, as I had mentioned earlier on. So let's take a look at what's new there. The first one is we're going to support a new service, which is Azure Files. So any file shares hosted within Azure, you can use that same policy-based automation, wizard-driven recoveries, as David was showing. That applies to full file shares, as well as file level recoveries. And that can be in place of the existing one or even to a new location. So each and every single release that we do from here on out, the goal is to always add a new service in. So now it is Azure VMs, Azure SQL, and Azure Files. The next one is configuration, backup, and recovery. So now you're able to actually take a backup of the appliance itself and store that in one of the repositories you configured, and then you can recover from that. So if you ever have to redeploy the appliance from scratch, if you're doing a migration, if you want to do some testing, you can now do that with Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure. There's some UI and UX enhancements as well. David does have a demo environment of V4, so he'll show you that. And you'll see the difference between kind of what he was just showing you as well as what's in V4. But you know, the major one is this new dashboard, right? So you've got a much better insight into the overall status of your protection environment, right? The infrastructure, the sessions, policy details, what's protected, what's not. So David will show you that in a second. And then the final one, it's probably not for everyone, but if you're in an organization where this is required, you can now deploy Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure into networks that have no public access to endpoints and storage accounts. So we're looking at that through a security lens. Again, not everyone's going to want to do this, but if you need to, that will be available in version 4. So for the last time, passing it back to you, David, to give us a glimpse at V4, and we'll get to some more questions. Keep them coming in, guys.
Yeah. So hopefully you can all see this screen. So sneak peek into the non-GA version of version 4. It's obviously coming soon, as Sam mentioned. So this is like a QA environment. So you'll see a few kind of quirks and stuff because it's not the GA version. But the first thing I want to show you is that new dashboard that Sam spoke about. So if you remember, I was showing you the previous version, which is our GA version. We have these like thumbnails at the top here. With the new version, we have a lot more insight into the environment and what we're actually doing. So we can see how many sessions have been successful, how many have failed, how many protected virtual machines we have, how many Azure files we're protecting, what percentage of our backups we have going on, how many snapshots we're using, how much data we're protecting through backups, in which archive tier they're in. We have our policies, so we're able to click on these and pick what the top policies are of protected data. And then we also have insight into the environment as well. So is everything working right? You know, are the workers doing what they should be doing? Has the storage account had any throttling applied to it via Azure or anything like that? So it gives us a lot of insight into that as well. Sam also talked about the configuration backup. We can go into our settings and we can apply, much in the same way you apply a backup policy. I want to go and take a backup of this. What do I want to protect? Do I want to enable my scheduling? how many restore points do I have, and so on. So I can specify that. And then what that will allow us to do is take a backup of all our policies, all our configuration options, all our worker settings and everything. And then in the event that I go in and I go click on workers and then I go and accidentally delete this and I forget what networks or whatever I've configured, I can actually go in to my settings, configuration backup, and just say I want to do a restore. I can also do it through Azure Snapshots as well. So very quick, very easy, and very simple to connect. The final thing is you'll notice that we now have a new resource tab here for Azure Files. We can add a policy into that, and we can specify what, again, our Azure Active Directory, what our regions are. We can pick all the regions that we want. So I can actually show you, I can just pick all the regions. We can go through, and then if we have any Azure file share set up, we can say, right, I want to protect all them. So very simple to protect Azure files, very simple to protect Azure SQL, as we saw, and very simple to protect our virtual machines as well and create policies for them. But the new dashboard is a big thing because it gives us so much insight into what's going on in our environment. And then back to you, Sam.
Awesome. So we'll start to bring this one home with 4 minutes left. We've got a number of questions come through. Before I get to those, there is a new ebook available that actually compares your Azure backup and recovery options to help pick the best fit for your organization. So there's a short URL there. If you guys are interested in taking a look at that, download that. Essentially what we do is we break down 5 capabilities of traditional backup and recovery, and then individual features within that, and then how just a snapshot based approach works, how Azure Backup, that product works, and then how Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure works as well. Every organization has different needs. So if you are currently evaluating any solutions, take a look through that. If there are certain features that you absolutely require that aren't available in some of these products but are in others, that will help you make up your mind pretty easily there. So 3 more minutes left. Let's have a look. All right, one question from Ashad. Sorry, fairly new to Veeam. Can you show or explain on backup job encryption and immutable storage feature? I'll take the immutable piece first. Currently not available in Azure. We've been wanting that to be available for quite some time. However, only just recently have Microsoft released the ability to lock objects at the object level rather than the bucket level. We do require it at that individual object level because we've got things like incremental backups and so forth. So that's just been made available. Product management, R&D, engineering, they are all hard at work at bringing immutability into Veeam Backup and Replication, and hopefully our cloud native products in the future. He also asks, does Veeam sizing estimate or capacity planning? That's available in Veeam 1. John asks, are there any plans to include application-aware backups for Oracle? I would say any feature requests that you have, post those on the Veeam forums. Everyone's very active on there, mostly product management, so that's the way to get those features directly to them. Michael says he uses Veeam Backup and Replication and wants to back up VMs to Azure. Is there a demo for that? Absolutely. I mean, we've had that technology for 5 years now. So we're talking about I guess the newer stuff, the ability to back up Azure itself. But if you want to back up a non-Azure workload into Azure, Veeam.com, there's a ton of demos out there about that. Like I said, we've been doing that for a long time. And then finally, Aaron asks, does Veeam Azure for GovCloud work in the same way as commercial? Good question. I believe the answer is yes. David, I'm not sure if you've got any additional information there.
Yeah, GovCloud. I can't really speak to too much about GovCloud because I'm not a US citizen, but GovCloud, the capabilities are there. What I would recommend is that you, for any information about GovCloud, then you reach out to the specific Veeam representative who can talk to you about that. But yes, the capabilities are exactly the same for Azure GovCloud as they are in this product that we've just demonstrated.
Fantastic. All right, well, if you have any more questions, please send them in. Dave and I will make sure that we get to them after this webinar. I do want to say thank you to everyone. In the comments, let us know what you think about this style. Do you prefer this more technical, in-depth, architectural, demo-driven? Are there things missing from this that you would like to see? Not necessarily related to content, because the content's specific, but just kind of the flow and the things that we include versus the topic. Please fill that in.